Hey, everybody, and welcome to the 5 Bytes Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Monahan. Coming up on this week's episode, Windows 10 reportedly increases its market share. Also, the CEO of Intel has stepped down. And there has been a discovery of the first ever UEFI bootkit targeting Linux. For this and more, keep listening to this episode of the podcast, which, of course, as always, is brought to you by my sponsors. And that includes Numescent, the inventors of the first and only cloud-native container management platform for Windows desktops. And also brought to you by Master Packager, who makes an application packaging software that helps you build packages that end users love, enterprises want, and the Windows OS needs. If you enjoy the show each week, you have these awesome sponsors to thank. And now for some news. After half a year of growth, Windows 11's global desktop market share has actually taken a slight downturn according to StatCounter, with the share going from 35.6% in October to 34.9% in November. Windows 10, on the other hand, managed to grow its share of that market by just under a percentage point to 61.8%. Now, this does seem odd, as it was trending consistently upwards, as the Register pointed out. 6 months of growth, and then suddenly it falls back. It seems kind of odd. The Register stated that they've reached out to StatCounter to verify that there's been no change to how they get their data. I'm going to keep an eye out to see if they update that story with whatever StatCounter comes back with, but assuming nothing has changed, because I believe they use data from a massive number of PCs globally, then I wonder, is it possible that some who have maybe jumped to Windows 11 and taken version 24H2 ended up rolling back to Windows 10 due to some sort of issues they encountered? Now, that's just speculation on my part. But somewhat aligned with this story, ZDNet has reported that Microsoft intends to add a watermark to any PCs running Windows 11 without supported hardware. An accompanying message will reportedly state, quote, "This PC doesn't meet the minimum system requirements for running Windows 11. These requirements help ensure a more reliable and higher quality experience. Installing Windows 11 on this PC is not recommended and may result in compatibility issues. If you proceed with installing Windows 11, your PC will no longer be supported and won't be entitled to receive updates. Damages to your PC due to lack of compatibility aren't covered under the manufacturer warranty. By selecting Accept, you are acknowledging that you read and understand this statement." End quote. On the support page, Microsoft even includes detailed steps on how to roll your unsupported Windows 11 PC back to Windows 10 if you change your mind, but this go back option is only available for up to 10 days after the upgrade. And I saw that Tom Warren was sharing on Blue Sky that Microsoft has indicated they have no intention of removing some of the hardware requirements for Windows 11, such as the TPM requirement. Also, in the ZDNet article, they seem to suggest that the statement from Microsoft means that you may not receive Windows updates if you're running Windows 11 on unsupported hardware, whereas the message indicates you just won't be entitled to receive updates, which the way I interpret that means, you're not entitled to them, but you probably get them, I'm guessing. Although, I would guess updates you might not get is you may not be able to take major upgrades like to a 25H1, for example, because they do seem to be more proactive in blocking those upgrades rather than monthly updates. So yeah, be sure to keep listening to the podcast. I'm sure there will be an update to this story and also the trends for Windows 11 in the new year. A class action suit has been taken in the United Kingdom in an attempt to get $1 billion in compensation from Microsoft for allegedly overcharging Google, Amazon, and Alibaba cloud computing customers by forcing them to pay additional licensing costs compared to those using Azure. The suit says, quote, "Microsoft is trying to force customers into using its cloud computing service Azure and restricting competition in the sector. This lawsuit aims to challenge Microsoft's anti-competitive behavior, push them to reveal exactly how much businesses in the UK have been illegally penalized, and return the money to organizations that have been unfairly overcharged." End quote. The case has been brought on an opt-out basis, meaning UK organizations are all being represented to begin with unless they wish to not be included. So this is interesting. Obviously, I've covered the fact that there's separate litigation or investigation going on by the US regulators. And again, I saw that Tom Warren on Blue Sky was sharing that I guess Microsoft is upset that some of the information from that investigation in the US was leaked. So on the front of litigation, it seems like a rocky time for Microsoft. But again, everything may change in a few months. It has been widely reported that as of December 1st, Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger is no longer with the company. And this was after a board meeting that occurred last week, during which the directors felt his costly and ambitious plan to turn Intel around was not working and the progress of change was not fast enough. This is, of course, in relation to the 5-year plan that Pat had put in place, I believe, back in 2021. The board told Gelsinger he could retire or be removed, and he chose to step down, according to a source to Reuters. Reports also suggest that he will receive $9.7 million in severance pay, so not too bad of a golden handshake there on the way out. To be honest, it seems like an insurmountable job for anyone to take on, just given what's happened in the space in the last few years. You know, the Spectre and Meltdown thing was just one problem, and it was a major issue for customers. The increase in ARM processors being used, obviously Apple going away from Intel, Microsoft reportedly possibly moving away from Intel themselves, and obviously Nvidia replacing them now on the stock market index. It is certainly a rocky time for Intel, and that's not even mentioning the layoffs that unfortunately have affected their employees too. A digital advertising executive has launched a new lawsuit against Apple for allegedly illegally monitoring its workers' personal devices and iCloud accounts, while also barring them from discussing their pay and working conditions. And this is according to a report from Inc.com. It has been claimed that Apple requires employees to install software on personal devices that they use for work, allowing Apple to access their email, photo libraries, health, and smart home data, and other personal information. The employee, who has worked for Apple since 2020, says he was barred from talking about his work on podcasts and instructed to remove information about his working conditions from his LinkedIn profile. Well, I would say that on the LinkedIn front, that seems a little extreme, although what are the specifics around what they didn't want included on LinkedIn? And then other than that, I mean, not talking on a podcast about your work isn't maybe that surprising. A lot of organizations would not be cool with that, at least not without approval. Apple said the claims in the lawsuit lack merit and that its workers are trained annually on their rights to discuss their working conditions. So we'll have to see if this suit has any legs. Interestingly, it seems that Citrix is now launching an independent release of Director for LTSR deployments, which will now provide an option to access the latest Citrix Director features for enhanced troubleshooting and monitoring of Citrix environments for compatible LTSR versions. This feature allows customers to use those latest versions on your 2402 LTSR deployments. Also, it provides access to features released after the LTSR announcements without impacting the application delivery infrastructure. The standalone installer includes the latest MSI for Monitor Service, Director Service, and the Monitor Snap-in, and using these new MSI files, you can upgrade your 2402 LTSR CU1 with the current Director release features. So this makes a lot of sense. I mean, why keep customers on older versions of Director just because they choose to keep the main infrastructure components on an LTSR version? So this is pretty cool. Update 2409 for Microsoft Configuration Manager current branch is now available. And with this version, it no longer supports SQL Server 2012 and 2014. So if you happen to have those for your database, maybe don't take this version just yet and get your database updated. Also, it's added operating system support for Windows 11 24H2 and also Windows Server 2025. It brings software metering support in ARM64 devices and BitLocker support in ARM64 devices too, plus more. And I'll share a link if you want to check out the full notes for this version, and I'll share that with this episode, which is episode 363. HowToGeek.com has reported that Microsoft has made some improvements to the Windows Store app, stating launch times are now 25% shorter and the number of failed downloads has been cut in half. The process for downloading and installing has also been updated to look better, with the new progress bar giving clearer updates during downloads, especially for bigger applications. They've also introduced better support for Win32 apps using the web installer, so if you're using that kind of web Windows app storefront, you should notice an improvement. There's design updates, improved search suggestions, and easier updates for Win32 apps. The Microsoft Store is also adding more apps with new entries like ChatGPT, Fantastical, Battle.net, World of Warcraft, and Arc. Microsoft has mentioned that more improvements are expected next year. BleepingComputer.com has reported that the latest preview of Firefox features a splash screen which gives 3 options, allowing you to pin Firefox to your taskbar, setting it as your default browser, and importing data from another browser. All of these options are now enabled by default, which BleepingComputer.com suggests is an aggressive approach by Mozilla, who has previously criticized Microsoft for similar tactics. The change is tied to an experiment aiming to streamline the onboarding process for users downloading Firefox through special marketing campaigns, where if a user chooses to install Firefox from a campaign that advertises it as, say, the default browser, Firefox will handle the setup process automatically, removing the need for manual configuration. The feature works by embedding a unique identifier called an attribution campaign ID into a lightweight stub installer that you download from Mozilla's website. When users run Firefox for the first time, the browser detects the identifier, and if the identifier matches the campaign to set Firefox as the default browser, Firefox initiates a background task to set itself as the default on the user system, thus probably why it makes sense to have those 3 options enabled by default. I mean, I wouldn't get too mad at Mozilla just playing the game that the others are playing. Don't hate the player, hate the game, as they say. Wirral University Teaching Hospital in the UK has suffered a cyber attack, according to BleepComputer.com, and it caused systems outages leading to postponing appointments and scheduled procedures. The attack was disclosed publicly on Monday, and the distribution was continuing as of the time of this recording. Collectively, these hospitals contribute to the NHS Trust and its total of 855 beds, and they provide 24-hour emergency services, acute medical services, critical care, surgery, diagnostic services, pediatrics, maternity services, and cancer care. So this is certainly not a small clinic. The hospital has said, quote, "We are working hard to rectify the issue after a major incident was declared at the trust earlier this week following a targeted cybersecurity issue. After detecting suspicious activity, as a precaution, we isolated our systems to ensure that the problem did not spread. This resulted in some IT systems being offline. We reverted to our business continuity process and are using paper rather than digital in the areas affected." End quote. So obviously when you go back to paper, even though services may continue to be available, scheduled appointments and procedures may have had to have been rescheduled in some instances, and waiting times in the emergency for treatment have had to increase. The hospital urges the public to visit the emergency department only if they have a genuine emergency to avoid burdening the system. Technology has become so important in healthcare, and unfortunately, some cyber gangs have said that they won't purposely target healthcare settings, but it seems like it just continues to happen regardless, and maybe not all cyber gangs are as moral as others. Security researchers say they've stumbled upon the first ever UEFI bootkit targeting Linux. It's dubbed BootKitty by ESET, and the first sample of the bootkit was detected on Malware Encyclopedia Virus Total earlier this month. It reportedly only works on a limited number of Ubuntu releases, and there are signs it's only a proof of concept at the moment. It's not thought to be under active development or in wider use by any sophisticated offensive operators right now. It has been believed that UEFI bootkits may only be a Windows problem, but it seems Linux users must beware too. According to a report from the Register, Beeks Group, a cloud operator headquartered in the UK, has moved most of its 20,000 plus virtual machines off VMware and over to OpenNebula, which is an open source cloud and edge computing platform. The report states that the organization still has some VMware VMs, but the majority of its machines are now moved to the open source platform. Beeks' head of production management, Matthew Cretney, said that one of the reasons for Beeks' migration was a VMware bill for, quote, 10 times the sum it previously paid for software licenses, end quote. The Register reports that according to Beeks, OpenNebula has enabled the company to dedicate more of its 3,000 bare metal server fleet to client loads instead of VM management, as it had to compared with what it used to do with VMware. Beeks is also apparently reporting a 200% increase in VM efficiency since it now has more VMs on each server. So it is certainly interesting to hear of a pretty large-scale migration away from VMware and over to an open source platform at that. To wrap up the news for this week, Ars Technica reported that the names David Mayer and Brian Hoods can break ChatGPT. They also reported that 404 Media discovered that the names Jonathan Zittrain and Jonathan Turley can also cause ChatGPT to just cut conversations short. The chat-breaking behavior occurs consistently when users mention these names in any context, and it results from a hard-coded filter that puts the brakes on the AI model's output before returning it to the user. While OpenAI has not confirmed why this behavior occurs with these names, Ars Technica pointed out that the name Brian Hood is related to someone who filed a lawsuit against OpenAI after discovering ChatGPT falsely claimed that he had been imprisoned for bribery when in fact he was a whistleblower who had exposed corporate misconduct. Some of the other names include those of other people who also seem to fall victim to AI misrepresenting them or are in some way linked to stories about lawsuits against OpenAI. Now, obviously, I guess this protects OpenAI in those cases by not having the generative AI spit out results relating to these people. However, it could also be seen as, censoring its own service and protecting the image of their company and the product. But now it's time for this week's scripts, tricks, and tips. First up, the MEM Summit has called out for speakers. So if you're interested in talking at a great event that's held in Paris next year, and you're in the desktop admin spot or you're working with physical endpoints in particular, this could be a good event for you to speak at. Next up, I saw the awesome Doug Fink has a event coming up where he's going to show you how you can turn PowerShell into your Excel automation machine. And this event is right around the corner. It's Friday, December 13th, and it's at 5:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. GMT, so my time. So I'm guessing that's like 1:30 p.m. Eastern for those in the US. Next up, I saw Patch My PC. Rudy Ooms had a blog post on the site about Intune Management Extension uninstallation protection. So if you've ever encountered where the extension uninstalls itself, and you find it really frustrating because frankly it is, you may want to look into this to protect yourself and prevent that from happening in the future. And finally, I saw on powerstacks.com, they shared a single pane of glass for reporting across Microsoft Intune, Microsoft Defender, and Configuration Manager. So if you're using multiple of those products and you'd like to kind of pool the reporting data together rather than having to grab from each one, this could be for you. Well, that's it for this week's episode of the podcast. Thank you all so much for listening.